Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KIS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of organic growing from a science-based perspective and draw in top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Our guest today has gone by the online name of Clackamas Coot on such forums as IC Mag and Lumperdawgz on Grass City. He is an organic grower and gardener who has helped many people in improving the way they garden and move away from bottled nutrients. He is most famous for his neem, crab, and kelp soil mix, which many people know as the Coot mix, which he shares freely, and the sprouted seed enzyme teas he makes using barley. I met Coot 8 or 9 years ago when he came to one of my talks in Portland on compost teas. We became friends, and I have to attribute a lot of credit to him in regards to our soil mixes and nutrient packs. He has been a good friend and mentor and helped me improve my gardens over the past decade. Well, before we start, I wanted to find out, did you want to go by Jim or Clackamas Coot?
Yeah, Jim. Yeah, I don't care. I mean, more people know me as Coot, unfortunately. So that's my fault, though.
You're not hiding anymore, your identity?
No, I never was. I got tired of Instagram and the silliness that go. I mean, I thought forums were bad, but they don't hold a candle to social media. Right. I mean, this is a whole,
Sure.
I just, I don't. Hey, look, I never made myself a big deal. All I ever did was pass out information about how people could make the soil better. Okay? I mean, I'm not selling anything. Everything's in a bottle. Everything's proprietary. I don't know. I'm disgusted with the whole thing. So anyway, I take it that obviously, given your type of business, with the teas and biology and what have you, or microbiology, did you ever run a test on the mammoth, mammoth microbes? But here's what got me, Ted.
I did. After we're done, check out our blog. That's my latest blog post. I took it, I looked at it in the scope, I added different ingredients as food sources. Because one of the claims that one of their sales guys, probably the guy you saw, I don't remember the guy's name, but he said that the microbes are in a dormant state. They're past their reproductive states, which wasn't something that I was even familiar with. I talked to Tim Wilson. He said that was a possibility, but he doubted it. Anyway, I talked to Colin Bell, the founder. Real smart guy.
Right.
I liked Colin a lot, actually, I have to say. We had a really good conversation. And from talking to him, I asked him straight up, I'm like, can I put this in a compost tea brew? Are they aerobic microorganisms? If I add a food source, what'll happen? And he said, yeah, you can probably reproduce them in a brew. So I just tested it out, posted all the microscope video of it, and let people draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, I know.
So have you been out to any dispensaries since cannabis was legalized in Oregon?
If you want good weed, you got to grow it yourself. It's just like tomatoes. You can't find a good tomato, can you, in this country? Because it's been decimated by hybrids, these production numbers, and they have the way they have to pick it. They pick them green. They run ethylene gas inside the trailers in transit so that when they arrive at the produce warehouses, they spend less time in the ripening rooms, which are injected with ethylene gas, just like bananas. But they also do avocados. They bring the color on. And once they get color, Dad, that's it. They're done. Get them out to the store because the consumer, all they want to see is color. They don't care what it tastes like. They don't care about anything. But if you want a good tomato, you got to grow your own, right?
Yeah, there you go. We grow our own every year. Every year, I always plant at least 3 new varieties.
Exactly.
This year, I have one Japanese trifele. I've never grown it before. It's a potato leaf shape.
Cool. Hey, it's the same thing, and it's the same thing in cannabis. It's the same thing in anything. I've been baking bread now for 20 years. I did 6 months at the Baking Institute of San Francisco. It was 6 months long, and then 3 weeks in France, working as slave labor, really, in bakeries. But what an opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. And then my daughter, anyway, real life stuff happened, and I wasn't able, because my plans were to open a bakery over on the coast. Well, it didn't happen. But I still have the skills, so I do all my own baking. And I promise you, unless you go to an artisan bakery and are willing to pay $7, $8 for a loaf of bread, you're not going to get that quality that you can make in your home. You want to talk about worm castings? That's what I'd like to talk about because that's what I really got going.
Sure, we can start off talking about worm castings. That'd be great.
Okay, because Doug gave me a yard, and I split it with Cool Kush, a yard of black leaf mold. Talk about carbon. Can you imagine what this is going to be like when it's finished? 100 gallons of premium worm castings, which would probably last me 2 years. You know, I'm like the smallest guy grower you've ever met, believe me. All right, well, worm castings is my hot button because I've been studying Edwards' vermiculture book and other writings by Rhonda Sherman and Yasmin Cardoza relative to not only the disease suppression benefits, but it was Yasmin Cardoza 4 years ago, the insect suppression properties of quality vermicompost. All right, let's go. Let's do worm cut because I got some really exciting news relative to neem and barley in the bedding.
Okay, I'd love to cover a little of those things. And then the other thing I've been arguing with people about recently is I got ripped up online for posting about how composted forest products, forest humus, all of those things is just code for sawdust.
Well, sure.
And that they're lower quality ingredients. Guys jumped on me saying, no way, peat's unsustainable. It's way worse.
Oh, I know.
These forest products are great. And I'm like, no, they're not. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with leaf mold.
They're not great.
And then so they're like, why not use...
This isn't leaf mold.
No, and that's the whole thing. They're like,
this is like,
use leaf mold, use forest duff. And I'm like, well, those are not commercially available, sustainable options. Peat's the best we have, you know? And I'm not saying it's perfect, but they, you know, use hemp fiber. Well, come on, guys. This isn't commercially available, you know? Like,
I know.
It was killing me. So I might want to ask you about that a little bit too, just to kind of, you know.
Sure. Because the arguments, before we start, the arguments are based on the political and economic issues in the British Isles. Because to this day, in the countryside, the majority of homes are heated and their cooking heat is peat moss. Well, the Brits want it for gardening, and the Irish are saying, no, we need this. This is like, you want to take our oil. Okay, so if you want us not to use peat, then you need to bring in the infrastructure and bring in natural gas or something into our homes. What do you want us to do? Here's another one. Are you a Scotch drinker?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've heard the term smoky.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, that comes from peat moss, because when they cook the malt or the wort, whatever it's called.
Oh, yeah, you can tell. There's some really peaty ones out there. Yeah.
Right. And so so Scotland and Ireland basically telling the Brits to go screw themselves. So they bring these arguments that are legitimate in the British Isles because it's politics, right? It's hubris. And it's economics. But to bring that to the Canadian deal that's tightly controlled by the CCSPM and the industry.
Well, there's a lot of propaganda out there from the cocoa industry now, you know.
It's not even the same thing. Oh, of course it is. Hey, they screwed themselves here in Oregon and California in the nursery industry 20 years ago. So where'd they turn? They turned to the weed growers. But it was a disaster because it's not plant material. Yes, it comes from a plant. It'd be like the same thing as saying, well, yeah, these are dandelion petals. Cute. How long did that take you, you know, to assimilate?
Yeah, it's a little crazy. So, yeah.
It is tightly monitored with, you know, they have adults in Canada running things. And so if their orders, SunGrow harvest more than all their competitors combined. The numbers from last year from CCSPM, that's the Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss. Oh, CSPMA, I'm sorry, Canadian Sphagnum Peat Moss Association. Okay. SunGrow harvested, you ready for this one? 54% of all the peat that was allowed to be harvested. But if SunGrow got big orders, they can't just go, well, hey, we're gonna pull another 50 truckloads. The amount that you're allowed to harvest is set. You're done. Like last year when Alaska Peat ran out before the buyout from Aurora Innovations, because on the bales, the 3.8 bales, like you and I use or have used, whatever, those are cut and wrapped at site. They're not processed. Now, the stuff that is bagged, hey, we'll talk about it, because that stuff is dried in a kiln. They call it sterilization. So they've killed the microbes. Then you bring it down to big plants like the one in Woodburn. It's ground to a consistent size. And now it's hit with steam. Why? Well, you got to get it wet again, because when the customer opens the bag, they're going to say, oh, God, look how fresh this is. No, not really. But I mean, so it's been sterilized in an oven in a kiln.
You're talking about the stuff used for cloning, or are you talking about smaller than a 3.8 bale?
Yeah, the stuff that goes in the bag stuff, like Sunshine Mix.
Oh, okay. I've never gone smaller than a 3.8 cubic foot bale.
Oh, yeah.
So
right. So when you buy a bag of any of ththose others, notice they say peat moss on them. Mm-hmm. Well, that's like saying flowers and what the kids call mids. You know, the shake. It ain't the good stuff. So what the big one is, oh, peat moss is acidic. Uh-huh. Why don't you talk about sphagnum peat moss? Oh, well, it's not acidic. Right, so don't use peat moss. Use sphagnum peat moss. I don't know.
It's a little acidic. It's not as acidic as I think people claim. But the nice thing about that acidity is it allows us to add calcium to get us back up to the levels that we want. Whereas with cocoa...
Okay, we need to talk about castings, because castings are literally coated.
Yeah, I wanted to go ahead and get started. You'd really want to talk about worm castings initially here. So why don't we dig right into that?
Well, I've been, at the request of my supplier, I did a little investigation on adding neem meal to the, what people incorrectly call bedding. And the numbers on both the reproduction rates as well as the length and girth, the increases in length and girth from the neem was quite remarkable. And then Doug at Northwest Redworms, he produces his vermicompost and worms in long windrows. And what he does as a general rule is to pile up the aged manure, and then he dumps in produce that he picks up from produce companies and what have you, number 2 stuff. And then he set up another one, and all he added was malted barley. And it wasn't at my request. I just told him that this is what it did in the soil, so he wanted to see what effect it would have in as far as creating vermicompost and worms to sell. He said that he had never seen the reproduction rates of worms like he saw in the pile with just the malted grains. And it makes sense, because what those grains are doing through the enzyme is deconstructing, it's a catalyst to deconstruct the material, making it more available to the microbes to break it down for the worms to ingest their manure. That's how castings are created. So my point is, he gave me a yard of black leaf mold, 3-year-old leaf mold, and I split it with a friend. So we each set up 100-gallon smart pots on a pallet for aeration through the bottom, of course. And then we added copious amounts of barley, neem, and karanja. And the other day, I just barely lifted up the little top layer of the bin, mm-hmm. and the worms were just massed. Like, it was crazy. I couldn't believe it. And I did start out with, I bought 6 pounds in 100 gallons. I bought 6 pounds of euros, because they tend to stay lower in the material and do a better job of finishing. And then when Doug loaded the stuff in the truck for me, he said, by the way, there's going to be quite a bit of red wigglers and cocoons in this material. So you're going to have reds, wigglers working the top, and the euros working the bottom of the bin.
That's the European worms? That's what you're referring to?
Yeah. That's why Europeans do not make a good choice for vertical flow through, because they tend to stay lower in the bedding. or what do we want to call it? The foods, I call it food stock because I'm talking about, I don't use kitchen stuff. I mean, I use either compost or good quality manure. My chiropractor has draft horses. You can imagine how much manure they produce every day. And he has them in a field, and he does give them vermicides, which you have to, but that's easy. Just age it for 4 to 6 weeks, and the vermicides that were given to the animals deconstruct, so they're no longer a problem. So it's pretty exciting. Pretty exciting because the reason I went with 6 pounds is I asked Doug if I want to have this finished before the rain season starts. So he mentally calculated. I says, I think that this will take care of it with the amount of red wigglers that you have and cocoons. Because what I saw the other day when I lifted up the material, obviously were wigglers because the Euros, I went ahead and just loaded them in the lower. I kind of did like a lasagna. I did manure and kelp meal, barley, neem, or karanja, and then do another layer of manure, the leaf mold. So it's kind of like sandwich. So these were definitely the red wigglers, and they were massing like you would expect to see if you threw in, like, say, chopped up fresh peaches or something. Something has a lot of sugar, and so I'm pretty excited about what I'm going to have when this is finished, because I figured that'll be enough for me for a couple of years. And so having the time and small amount of startup money, I'm going to have some pretty nice castings when it's over. Because the thing about cold compost, and I learned this from your father, one time we were talking about cold composting, is that many, if not most, of the secondary metabolites in the plant material remain intact. They're not lost like they are in thermophilic composting. So that's exciting to have those properties from the neem and the karanja with regard to insects and disease suppression. So that's and also then you can add other materials like I don't know how you've been up there because we all had a lot of rain this year, but I already did my first cutting on comfrey, which is usually I don't get a cutting till the middle of June, and the ones I cut, they're already back to over 15 inches tall. It's a shame you can't cross comfrey with every food plant in the world because you'd end world hunger.
Yeah, we're in the same page up here. We've already done our first cutting, and we're well on our way towards our second cutting already.
Crazy, isn't it?
It is.
Talk about free fertilizer. I don't like using that word, but newts. You can't do any better than kelp and comfrey and alfalfa. Those three, in some, either by themselves or in some combination, does nothing but good things, I think, for our soils.
Now, I do want to caution listeners in regards to comfrey because two things. One, it's important that you use a sterile variety. I think it's the Bocking 14 is the one that is most popular. I think that's the one we have on our property.
Right.
But in addition to that, wherever you plant that comfrey, you're making a lifetime commitment to having a plant there.
That's right. It owns that piece of real estate.
Our staff made some poor choices that I wasn't aware of at the time with a couple plantings of comfrey, and now we have it inside our garden, whereas before we were just using it as a great weed barrier, a border for poorer quality soils as a way of keeping seeds out of the garden.
Right.
And it worked great for that, but when we got a few into the middle of the garden that had been planted there or, poorly weeded, we're having a heck of a time getting it removed. That and horsetail, oh man, or not horsetail, I apologize, horseradish. I planted some horseradish, and oh my gosh, I can't get rid of that either.
Oh, really? Can I explain the Bocking nomenclature?
Yeah, please do. And explain a little bit more about comfrey. Let's just talk about that really quick.
Sure. Okay, back at the end of the 18th century, in 1790, were the first seeds that were sold in Great Britain. Not that the plant hadn't been around. The plant's one of the ancient ones out of the Greek era. 500 before the Common Era thing. But they were selling seeds because it was an incredible livestock feed. But it's extremely invasive. But the thing about fertilizer didn't really happen until closer to like the 1870s. But in the 1930s, a nurseryman in Essex, England, whose nursery was on Barking Road, named Lawrence Hills, whose book Comfrey, Past, Present, and Future is a summation of his research. And one of the research stations was here in Canby, Oregon, just a few miles south of Portland. And those documents are still in the library. You can't check them out, but you can go into their reading rooms and review them. So originally they were close to 20 different Barking 1 through Barking 20. I'd have to check the book because I don't want to get out bad information. I don't remember exactly why the Barking 14 is the one that survived or became the one. So basically everybody that grows Barking 14 is growing root cuts from a plant that was established about 1945. And for those who pay homage to the genetic drift, that might be something to consider. But in any event, so that cutting has been passed around now for over 72 years. I think it's pretty remarkable. And yes, the steriles are great, but like you said, that postage stamp piece of real estate you plant it, they own it. The price in Portland area right now starts at $300 to remove a comfrey plant. Because remember, they put down roots twice as deep as a fruit tree. And people that do silly things like take a rototiller to it find the next year they have, hundreds of sterile plants, because it doesn't take much to start a new plant, just a little bit of root material. Yeah. As you probably, because I know you prepare them for your customers, so it doesn't take much to in a little container of the soil, and you're going to have another plant.
Yeah, a quarter inch, half inch of a root can potentially start another plant. It's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. And by this, not the first year, but by let's say you planted it now, a new one. One of your customers come into your nursery and bought one. You're not going to get much this year, but even by next year, you're already going to start getting some really nice amounts of comfrey biomass to work with. And I used to make the tea where you soak it till it smells like manure. That's just so silly. I just cut it down, top dress it as green mulch, and you know yourself how fast it disappears. I mean, there's so much nitrogen. Plus, it's 99% water. So pretty soon it's just disappears.
Yeah, I do see powdery mildew on it in the fall. So I don't like to.
Oh, I do too, yeah.
Go straight into my compost pile rather than into my garden.
Right.
The reason that we use comfrey, I think, is really important to let people know in terms of it being a dynamic accumulator, how it pulls nutrients up from the subsoil and minerals that are not normally accessible to your other plants that are not putting roots quite so deep, and then produces a ton of biomass. That leaf matter that we get out of it is really that's essentially free nutrients.
Well, that's the same thing that alfalfa, especially here in the Northwest, because it's grown primarily east of the Cascades. Well, those soils are some of the richest volcanic soils in the world, literally. And alfalfa, because you don't plant it every year, you go broke, you're priced alfalfa seeds. So by the time you're into your fourth or fifth year, you're deeper than 30 feet. So it too, which is almost twice as deep as the comfrey. And then the final nutrient accumulator that I'd like to mention is kelp. Here's a plant that grows, what is it? It's like 250 feet a year without a root system. And what's remarkable is that it accumulates 83 elements, but it leaves the ones that would impact its growth and then also our garden if we used it, and that would be salt. It doesn't accumulate salt. Mm-hmm. So, in my opinion, kelp meal, alfalfa, and comfrey are some of the top bionutrient accumulators, because in the case of the land plants, how deep their roots go, and the kelp that we get comes out of the North Atlantic, and the human race has been pulling that kelp out of the ocean since 1372 to use as fertilizer. In the early days, they used to burn it. I don't know why you have to do that with wood to release, what is it, the potassium?
Yeah, potash, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not necessary with the kelp. And the advantage to the kelp is all those elements, all 83, are in the right balance. It's not like the grocery store stuff. Well, no, this one's magnesium hungry, so you really want a high dose of magnesium. No, you don't. That's the best way to screw up your soil, because just like when you're a child and you got sick, your mom might have given you milk of magnesia, right? Because it tightens up your flora in your gut. Well, it does the same thing in the soil and restricts the airflow and water flow in the soil. Plus, I know you don't want to get into this, but the whole imbalance of turning the cation exchange capacity on its head with excessive magnesium. But anyway, the kelp and all these, the other two, everything's in the right balance. And I think they really add to, if I were going to make compost piles, I would compost my material first. And then in the mesophilic stage, that's when I would add those accumulators. I wouldn't put it in at the start. Why burn them up, right? So when it drops down below 100 and you're starting hopefully, your several month cure of your compost, then you can add those materials. And again, just like your dad and I talked about cold composting, those compounds are going to remain intact. We just had the worm castings from Doug tested, and I do mine the same way he does, but I was telling you the other day, it came in at 6.8 pH. You're not going to get any better than that. Mm-hmm. And that's without any amendments, or that's just the raw castings. And something that a lot of people don't quite understand about castings is that inside the worm's gut, not gut, but digestive tract, they don't have a stomach. The material, the castings are covered with a calcium carbonate slime. You can't have problems if you're using quality castings in that regard. You can do some other silly stuff, but
one thing that I think is a little unique is you invest a lot of time, a lot of money in creating high quality castings.
Correct.
As part of your own personal soil when you make up your recipe.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit more about why this is so important as a fraction of your total media?
Oh, it's obviously too much. I take that hit all the time, and I just shrug my shoulders and say, yeah, okay, whatever. It is true. You don't need to, okay, my mix is the one that we all talked about years ago when we all met at IC Mag. A third of Spagna peat moss, and I don't want to get into this discussion, but I happen to prefer pumice or lava rock, which is scoria, because I can buy it at the landscape yards for nothing. I just have I don't like perlite, because when I owned a nursery, we grew plants that have to be in the field for several years, Japanese lace maples. And perlite moves around, floats to the top. Pumice doesn't float, stays where it's supposed to be in the strata. Okay, and then a third castings. Is that too much? I don't know. For some people, if you don't have your own thing going, maybe it is. But as poor quality as we do a lot of gardening here in the Northwest. That's a good thing. That means there's a lot of different choices for compost, which is, as it's turned out, isn't always such a good thing, because, let's be honest, there's just a lot of products that aren't very good.
It's definitely a problem. We use the Oli compost. I think I told you about it, almost a decade ago. And it's a good product. It's not perfect. They do use a little bit of post-consumer waste, so occasionally we find some plastic in there, which I'm not terribly excited about. But the thing that they do right versus all these other companies is what you talked about with that static composting pile. That material sits for 2 to 3 years.
Right.
And that's just something that you don't see in any of these other commercial composting facilities. And It's a huge, huge difference that I can't emphasize enough.
Absolutely. The value of compost, in my opinion, is the key component is how long was it cured. And we proved that with our castings, because the material we're starting with, the castings that I'm creating right now with the black leaf mold, which was really that's a big gift, because yourself, that's a multi-year process to create black leaf mold.
Oh yeah, that's what we made a lot of our compost out of for years, our fungal compost. It's a wonderful starting material.
Exactly. So I'm already starting off with material that's 3 years old. Now, I don't have the lab equipment that would be necessary to test it. On the other hand, the chances of me buying lab equipment to grow plants is somewhere between nil and none. I mean, I don't care. I mean, if it didn't work, then I gotta go. I've never had bad worm castings. I'll just leave it at that. Even when I've had to start with 1 year, health reasons, I couldn't make my own compost, so don't laugh. But I went and bought bagged compost at Portland Nursery.
Okay.
And I knew going in that it wasn't going to be good, but the old expression about value-added commodities, right? By the time it ran through the vermiculture cycle, it was good. But I made sure I added things like, I'm a big kelp user. I use it in my raised beds because, in fact, you were the one that told me about the book several years ago, Dr. Sen's Seaweed and Plant Growth or something like that. Seaweed and Plants or something.
It's Seaweed and Plant Growth.
He was the one who put maxi-crop on the map back in the 50s. William Stafford was the founder of maxi-crop, and they began using a process. It was never intended as a retail product. This was strictly an agricultural product, something that could be mixed in the water and applied to large fields and orchards and what have you. So they were using sodium hydroxide. And then, I don't know, probably in the 70s maybe it was the 80s, you started seeing maxi-crop show up at retail nurseries in a liquid form. Well, they bring it into their factory south of Chicago on the Illinois River? Anyway, so they mix it with water there and bottle it, because you're not going to ship bottles of fertilizer from Norway to Portland, Oregon and have it make any sense as far as, price. Mm-hmm. So you got to bring it in as a powder. My objection to the powders is that everything is destroyed in terms of plant hormones, secondary metabolites, and the big one is alginic acid. Alginic acid can hold 250 to 300% of its weight in water. So for outdoor raised bed venues and that kind of thing, having kelp in there is a good way to maintain the wetness. I can't think of the term right now. I'm sorry.
Moisture retention content.
Yeah, so it helps that move along. It's not a cure-all, but it's part of, and that's what good compost does too. It retains water and slows down and then we use our mulch. We slow down the evaporation, because most water that we apply to our gardens is lost through evaporation. Imagine, look at the numbers. Sometimes it's kind of staggering, the percentage of 5 gallons of water on a raised bed, how much goes up in the air.
Sure. Well, one thing I want to address is when people talk about your soil recipe, it's probably the most popular, freely available soil recipe for organic gardeners that want to do living soil.
Can I address that, though?
Yeah, I wanted to give you the opportunity, a little platform to talk about that.
All right, because this is a joke. And I've said this written this, posted it many times. In 1937 or 38, Cornell University, which, as you know, is one of the leading horticulture research schools in the world, not just the United States, but the world. And a lot of things were established that day. As an example, or that week, whatever it was, a number one nursery pot, right, isn't a gallon, never was a gallon. And a number two isn't necessarily exactly twice. It depends on the manufacturer. If you're in the nursery business, when you go to the suppliers and you pick out the sheet or the product, they'll hand you a sheet and it'll tell you how many units you're going to get per yard of that size of container. But it was a shovelful. So they were trying to begin a process of standardizing things. Show you how old this was. This is before perlite. That kind of puts things in perspective for you. All people have to do is look up the Cornell mix. That's all I did, and modified it a bit. And I only used 3, well, I guess you'd say 5. Okay. I use copious amounts of basalt rock dust, and we're blessed here in the Northwest because we have some of the best basalt in the world. It has to do with hardness. Mm-hmm. I add, as you know, I'm the one introduced using malted grains in the soil. But in terms of what most people would call amendments, it's limited to 3. Kelp, neem, and crab meal. Now, I've kind of backed off crab meal because that's a lot of money to get the chitin when I can get all the chitin I need and dew from the malted grains, barley in particular. That's it. So when people say, well, I did that Coos mix and God, the potassium was just off the chart. No, you didn't. You didn't do mine. You went and got something locally. It may have been steer manure from Walmart for all I know. I have no idea what you used. You didn't make my mix because you don't have my castings. So say that you made a recipe, but I changed things and now I don't like it. Okay, then don't do it. I'm not making any money off this. And I really don't care what they use. And someone has to spend an inordinate amount of time whining about something that is just silly. If you use bad biology in your soil, you're going to have a bad soil. That's all there is to it. If you're going to use unfinished compost, I don't need to explain the science to you. You know what it does to the roots. It burns them. So garbage in, garbage out. You want good potting soil? You got to start with some good. And, you got to plan ahead. Maybe this year you got to get by doing this, but you can start a worm bin today. All you got to do is go buy a smart pot, load it up with some aged manure, and put in some aeration material because, this is an aerobic process, vermiculture, and then buy all the worms you can afford.
Or cocoons.
It's not complicated.
Or you can get the cocoons. I found that's a more affordable way.
Yes, right. Cocoons that's another way. Online, there's a gentleman down in Georgia. I don't know, something like that. And he's like the guru of cocoons. I mean, he sells them to the commercial. But yeah, I mean, figure each cocoon, the average is 3.8 worms per cocoon. I mean, think about this. So once a cocoon hatches, or the hatchlings leave the cocoon, within 42 days, they're sexually mature. They then will produce 3 cocoons a week. So that means that every worm is going to produce at least, on average, 10 new worms. This is red wigglers. Others have different reproduction rates. So think about that for a minute. And the numbers put in Dr. Edwards' vermiculture technology book, that if you had perfect conditions, and we never will, but let's say that we could set this up, a pound of worms today would be 1,000 pounds a year from today. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think the name of the company that you turned me on to was Blue Ridge Vermiculture. Is that ring a bell?
Oh, right. Yeah. I think he was in North Carolina and also had something set up in the Bay Area, Oakland. Anyway, yeah, that Blue Ridge, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the important thing, essentially what you're saying is that in order for people to truly evaluate the quality of your recipe, they would actually have to use your worm castings. And we've already talked a little bit of how much time and energy you put into creating those worm casting and what an important aspect of your total soil that really is.
Then I don't have to have a newt program. I don't have to be, with a dog collar and a choke chain, tied to, I don't name names because they might be an advertiser or something, but it's just, the whole thing is silly to me. I've been to a couple of these weed thing, events, and they have these, these companies have these beautiful displays, and they put people in there who they could either be selling insurance door to door on Saturday morning, or used car salesman. I mean, look, ammonium nitrate's ammonium nitrate. I mean, go take a chemistry 101 at the community college down the street. Just people are buying stuff because of the label, and then the big one that gets me is, well, it's proprietary. Well, then you're an idiot for buying that stuff. You're believing that there's some mythology, that there's something special that has to go into this newt product so you can grow whatever it is you're wanting to grow. I mean, can you imagine the tomato industry doing that? The first guy that shows up, sales rep at California Tomato Commission, and all of a sudden, hey, we're all going to switch over to this because look at this cool label. That's a hot button with me.
No, I know. And I think the reason we see these nutrient programs in general being so successful is because either A, people are starting with a poor quality media, or what I see a lot of is people are trying to grow like they would hydroponically with organic soil.
Oh, exactly.
So you have giant plant, tiny pot. You can't get a 5-foot plant in a 3-gallon pot. It just doesn't work.
Nope. Yeah, I mean, there has to be. That's one of the reasons that I think you were there at that point when one day I wouldn't call it a study, but it was a field test conducted in Aurora, Oregon, at the research station for, I think it's OSU is the one that runs that. Anyway, at that time, as a group, they're called auto pruning pots, and Smart Pot is a brand. And then, I don't know, now there's Geopot, but they did a test on the ones that were commercially, for commercial growers. Airpot, remember that one, Caledonia Tree Company? Mm-hmm. Dumbest idea for cannabis ever. I mean, dumb. It's a difference between growing saplings, and I speak from experience, than growing a annual. Just a whole different dynamic. You ever notice how small the diameter is on those?
Mm-hmm. They're tall cylinders. They're narrow cylinders, yeah.
Right. One of the biggest losses in the nursery industry is what's called knockovers, and that comes from wind and storms, right? So the last thing you want is something that's top heavy. I mean, it's challenging enough. That's why the Smart Pot, which their parent company, before there was Smart Pot, it was called Tree Bag Company. And then it morphed into High Caliper. But those are still manufactured for the sapling growers. And if you're interested, you can go to those separate websites, not Smart Pot, but it's part of the same group. But as a group, the auto pruning pots do allow you to get more biomass than they say. You had a 5-gallon standard, what they call them, the black lipped nursery pot. So that's the ones you get when you go to Home Depot and buy a plant. It's going to be in one of those. Or if you use the number 5, which Smart Pot, yes, you can get more biomass, but you're not going to get double. I mean, you have to set up your garden that makes sense to you and then live within those restrictions. Because trying to push something, because Johnny at Grass City or IC Mag or whatever says, oh yeah, just, fill in the blank. And then, you've got these silly concoctions that make zero sense. For me, if I had a poor soil, my focus would be what it is now: kelp, alfalfa, and neem. And if it's that bad, then do better next year. Make better choices. That's my read.
Yeah, I wanted to change directions a little bit and talk a little bit more about barley. That's sort of something that you've really brought to the cannabis industry, this idea of enzymes from barley and enzyme teas. And I know you started out initially sprouting the barley after attending a beer making class.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about where you're at now with it and your thoughts?
Sure.
And why?
Exactly. I had attended the San Francisco Baking Institute in preparation to open or accurately and not so accurate, called Artisan Bakeries. And in what they call lean doughs, which means just the 4 elements: yeast, salt, flour, and water for baguettes and things, they will also add what is called malt or diastatic malt. And so I would buy that from a bakery supply house and never really understood or really cared much what diastatic meant. So one day, out of sheer boredom, I decided to look it up. And then I realized, well, this is just barley malt. And diastatic means that the enzymes weren't killed like it is with, like, barley extract is not diastatic, it's non-diastatic. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any value. I mean, the sugars are there and some other things. Okay. So then it was Tim Wilson and I were talking back and forth online, and I asked him about yeast that's used to, commercial yeast for bread baking, and which is a single-celled fungi. So we add diastatic malt to our bread to enhance the activity of the yeast. So I'm thinking, well, what if we put sprouted barley? At this point, I still didn't understand that you could just go buy this stuff, at a brew store. So I'd go over to Bob's Red Mill and get organic barley, raw, and then that's all malting means, is just you let it sprout or germinate. Really, you don't grow it taproot at all. And then one day, a friend who fancies himself to be a beer master said, "Why don't you just go buy malted barley at the brew store? They make this stuff." Yeah. So I went and bought it, and the rest is history. I started adding it, and then other people. The first thing that I saw, besides the increase in resin set, is that we were cutting off several percentage points off the flowering period. One of the advantages that I have that probably a lot of people don't is that I've been growing the same, not strain, the same plant through cuts, mother cut, for 33 years. So that when I test something, I can immediately know what is standard and if what change there is good or bad, right?
That's a huge benefit. It's essentially your control, your genetic control. So
Right, exactly. Because so many people I see, well, yeah, I'm going to try fill in the blank, whatever it is, and this time I'm going to use this seed or cut. Okay, well, that's cool, but it has nothing to do with research. So immediately I saw that I was finishing 15% faster. And then other people who use different methods of determining when it's finished started and I never even discussed it because I wasn't sure. But then there was just too many people posting that, yeah, I'm seeing 15-20% reduction. But the main thing that I saw is the increase in the girth and what I would call the tensile strength of the branches. I was having to use far less support in the later stages of flowering from the flowers being so heavy. But the resin set is off the chart. And some of the fellows, especially at Instagram, that I couldn't believe how much they were adding. I mean, I'm really cautious, as you know. But some of these guys are adding 5 pounds a week, on 200-gallon pots, the outdoor, the boys of summer. And I said, are you sure? I mean, that kind of seems insane amount. But now that I've been adding it to my worm bin, I can't believe the amount of biology activity with not just the worms, but the other organisms that we find in a healthy worm bin, the shredders and the this and that. Unfortunately, because of what happens when you try to bottle, and I've approached a lot of brewers. First of all, brewers only care about one enzyme, amylase. That's it. But in barley, we have urease, protease, phosphatase. There's a total of 8. I've posted it so many times I can almost type it automatically without even reading it. Because I know from bread baking, if you use too much malt, or diastatic malt as they call it, that all of a sudden you lose your structure. And your structure is what? Well, it's gluten. What's gluten? Protein. Now I learned that it's the protease, too high levels of protease weakens the structure of the gluten, so therefore you're not getting what bakers call the inside of the outside is called the crumb, right? So the inside is called the outside is called the crust, and the inside they refer to it as the crumb. Bakers will talk about, well, how's the crumb on that flour, as an example, right? So if you use too much diastatic malt, the protease is accelerating the breakdown of the gluten, the protein which provides the structure to the bread. Now, in our soils, that wouldn't be an issue. And what I can attest to is that not one person in my circle, and I don't read too much online because people will mix it with, ammonia because somebody told them to do it. And that malt didn't work. It burned my plants. Oh, okay. It wasn't the ammonia, right? It was the barley. But we're seeing incredible acceleration. Like after you transplant your rooted cuts and just sprinkle maybe like a half a teaspoon of barley on top and just water it in. That alone will accelerate the root growth to get them ready for transplanting faster, depending on your system of rooting.
Jim, can you expand a little bit more about what enzymes do, why they're important, what the barley's doing or you think is doing that's making it so beneficial to soils?
In part, the amylase, of course. What's amylase do? That's our saliva is uber levels of amylase. It starts breaking down sugars, right? Carbohydrates into simple sugars. Well, that's what plants use. And protease, proteins, urease, urea, and then phosphatase, which, since that's a popular discussion, especially in cannabis boards, phosphorus, real or imagined, that one should really get them excited because these things, the description used by biologists is that enzymes are catalysts. And so chitinase, for example, chitinase is important because chitin in and of itself doesn't really do much in the soil. Chitin is a polysaccharide. It's an acetyl form of a glucosamine. It's what if you had surgery, either external or oral surgery, they'll sew you up with chitin. And here's another interesting connection to the Albert Hofmann, the man who isolated several compounds in ALD 52 and LSD 25, and later went when he was at Sandoz Labs. Well, at the age of 22, if you can imagine this, he graduates with a doctorate in chemistry or biology, doesn't matter. He was the one who figured out the molecular, not formula, but structure of chitin. And it was a big deal in 1922. So he was like this, this genius. So he really understood the complexities of these. And that's what, for example, LSD is. It's grown on rye ergo. It's a mold. And so in our soils, they accelerate the chitin as the bacteria try to deconstruct this polysaccharide. It creates chitinase. And it's chitinase that gives us the benefits. So that's what deconstructs the eggshells of insects, as an example. There's also topics that listeners might be interested in is the chitinase salicylic acid pathway, which is one of the several pathways that plants have as a defense system, the SAR, the systemic acquired resistance. There's others. There's ethylene, salicylic. Salicylic acid is a key component in several of the pathways, which is why I've also been a big advocate of using quality aloe vera materials. So when we add the barley to, and I really strongly, if people are going to do a worm bin, please add all the barley you can, because it will really accelerate the conversion of manure into vermicompost. And that's another reason to use fulvic acid, because Dr. Foss he has an interesting description of fulvic acid. So enzymes are catalysts, and then he wrote that fulvic acid, pure fulvic acid, is a catalyst of catalyst, and a reason to do according to the directions, because his products are professional, don't start high dosing. If you want to see Jurassic Park plants, start high dosing with fulvic acid. And that's something you're not going to be able to flush out either. Do you use barley?
Yeah, we've started using it in our nursery. In our we do edible veggie starts, and then we're just now planting our rows out. And so I have
Sure.
Well, the stuff that I've been working with you on with the tinctures, I've been using that in trials in different rows, comparing plants.
Right.
And I'm hoping to share that with you here really soon. But I haven't done just the straight barley. Now, I've just set up my vegetable garden, because I'm not actually growing any cannabis.
No.
I just set up my vegetable garden.
Most of my gardening is vegetables too. But,
yeah, so I've started using my raised bed there, and I just planted my tomatoes last week, so I'm excited to start trying out some of these things here at home too.
One thing I'd like to tell your audience is that when you go to a home brew store, it doesn't matter what grain you get. So if they have rye on sale, malted rye, buy malted rye. If they have oats, which is one of my favorite for no other reason than to me it sounds cool. I keep thinking of the guy on the Quaker Oats box, But anyway, by price. And sometimes they'll have distressed merchandise, maybe water damage to the sack or whatever. Just go ahead and get it. I mean, okay, Steinbart in Portland, they're the oldest brew store in the United States. They started 98 years ago. You wouldn't believe the number of people. When I started doing that, I said, well, yeah, Steinbart's has everything. And they do. You go in there and they probably have 10 different malted grains, different red wheat, white wheat, barley, spelt, oats. You get the idea. A lot of different seeds. And they were telling me that you wouldn't believe how many people order from us. I said, they don't have brew stores in Chicago. I mean, use some imagination, I mean, something. And also I'd like to add, I'm not saying that you don't want to use it. Certainly in compost, it's a good thing. But do not use spent brewery grain the same way that you're going to use malted barley. They're two different. The one has been changed through the fermentation process, so it's not the same thing. And you can really get into trouble. So either go buy the real stuff or do something else, is what I'm saying. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that spent grains aren't good. They are. But it's not the same thing.
That's a really good point. And you like to, let's talk a little bit more about how you process it. So when you go in there, I know at FH Steinbart's, they have a grinder there that they can adjust, and you like that coarser ground,
Right.
multigrain.
Yeah, I mean that's really comes down to personal. I mean, if I'm going to mix soil, yeah, I mean larger pieces are fine. When I first started, I used a grain mill that I bought from Austria, a Como, and got it to the finest powder that I could so that I could sprinkle it on top the soil and then water it in with a Chapin concrete sprayer, so really get it pushed down in there. So if I were going to top dress, I'd probably want to use the finest grain you can get. But if you're preparing soil, or certainly for your compost material, then you could get larger. But it's a free service, and most larger, from what I understand, I've traveled around the country looking at them, but I understand that most stores have grinders for their customers to grind the grains they buy for the home brewing sector.
Yeah, they usually charge a nominal fee. They're not able to adjust the grind sometimes. You get what you get, but that's not the end of the world. The advantage of a finer grind, like you mentioned, is greater surface area, so that the microbes are going to be able to break it down faster.
Correct. And that was proven at a project that I was involved in. And I told them to grind it, or worst case scenario, let me know, and I would do a few pounds for them in my Como grinder. Anyway, they decided, well, no, we're not going to grind it at all. And they mixed it with the whole malted grain with worm castings and top dressed some plants in a public garden that were under distress. Now, what was interesting is that in spite of the fact when I went out to visit like 2 weeks later, the grains were still intact for the most part. But the amount of evidence of fungal growth, mycelium, just exploded in the areas surrounding the piece of grain. Now that's kind of exciting news, because that confirms what I thought, is that this was really a very a very good food for fungal development in our compost, worm bins, and in our soils. So I'll send you the photo that was taken at 20x, and it's pretty spectacular. I mean, looks like some bad cheese, you forgot about in the back of the refrigerator or something. And it's the right color and all that stuff. One of the problems in trying to get information about malt is that I talked to over 20 brewmasters, and even a couple, the head people or founders of artisan malting houses. Do you know that not one had any idea that there was something called chitinase in barley, malted grains, or phosphatase, or urease, or protease? I mean, I was blown away. But they could talk about amylase. Whew, they got that one down, because that's the one that is central to the process of brewing beer. And can I address one other thing? There's two types of barley. There's 2-row and 6-row. 6-row is pretty much only grown in America, and it has higher levels of amylase. That does not translate into that it has higher levels of these other enzymes, the ones I care about, the chitinase, phosphatase, for example. And because it's a much smaller crop, a harvested crop, you're going to pay through the nose for 6-row. It isn't necessary. Just get and again, you don't have to use barley. Use whatever they have at the home brew store and by price. Now, there is one little caveat. Rye has slightly higher levels of phosphorus, so that should become really popular here with a certain sector of gardeners that obsess about phosphorus. So if phosphorus is your big thing, then go for the rye.
That was part 1 of our interview with Jim Bennett, also known online as Clackamas Coot. In our next installment, we discuss neem in further depth, and also the history of the cultivar that Jim has been growing now for over 40 years. You are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Stay tuned for future podcasts from leading experts around the industry. Don't forget that there's more information and articles available on our website and blog at www.kisorganics.com. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please take a moment to leave me a review on iTunes and send me your feedback and suggestions through our website contact page.